Hello everybody, it's the Historical Gamer once again, and today we're returning to Close Combat 2, A Bridge Too Far, the 1997 classic made by Atomic Games, published by Microsoft, and now owned by Matrix and Slytherin Games and recently republished on Good Old Games. Good Old Games, or GOG, is a website which is devoted to, well, not devoted, but certainly specializes in remastering old games and making them run on modern operating systems, and that's how we're able to bring this classic of 20 years plus old to you on a modern operating system and playing it. And by we, I just mean I'm me playing it and showing it to you. I have no affiliation with this game whatsoever. This is part 3 of my campaign of Close Combat 2. In our first battle, we successfully drove the Germans off the map of the railroad bridge in Arnhem with our British forces up there, although the bridge itself was destroyed. It's not a critical bridge in the overall scheme of things. The second battle was the Battle of, I believe, Son Town. We didn't quite get to the bridge at Son, but we successfully took that piece of the map and also destroyed the German forces on the map there. And now we're joining you mid-stride in a battle for the Schindel Road, which we're currently assaulting with our American airborne troops and working in this campaign. Now, this video series is really less about the gameplay. That's something I've been kind of stressing the whole time, and it's more about the history, and that's why there's a bit of a gap, because it does require me to do some reading, some research, and sort of getting up to speed on things. Because while I know Civil War history, at least in the Eastern Theater, kind of on the back of my mind, I know World War II history at more of a 30,000-foot level in Europe. I know that, in June of 1944, the Allies landed in Normandy, that in July, the Allies would eventually launch Operation Cobra and break out. After bloody fighting in and around Caen, they would break out, drive to Paris, liberate Paris, drive on Germany, outstrip their supply lines, launch a fatally flawed campaign at Market Garden, which is what we're looking at here, in an effort to get across the Rhine. Things would kind of bog down from there, and then German Ardennes counterattack at the Battle of the Bulge, and then the German defensive crust gets cracked in early 1945, and the Allies cross into Germany, and the war is over. That is sort of my high-level understanding of the operations in Europe. Obviously, I know more than that, but just giving you some basis of where I'm coming from. So in our first couple of videos, we talked about the impetus of Operation Market Garden, the supply crisis that the Allies were facing, the somewhat self-imposed supply crisis that the Allies were facing, this logistical issue that the Allies had sort of created for themselves by intentionally abandoning the plan that they had drafted before Operation Overlord, the plan that had seen them taking the Brittany ports and creating a new port in Brittany to supply the advance, and how they had kind of gone away from that into more of a contain Brittany but not leverage its ports and drive east anyway, relying on the Normandy beaches to provide the supply, and how that was wholly inadequate to their purposes and would lead to the supply shortfalls, which would really give General Eisenhower the willingness to accept Operation Market Garden, which was an assault on a narrow front with one axis, one Allied army, or one Allied corps in this case, and try and drive up a narrow front and break through the German lines. He had sort of been following this broad front strategy, and he abandoned that overarching strategy of hitting the Germans everywhere at once simultaneously all across France, so that the Germans simply could not respond to every advance and would have no way of holding the Allies back, just overwhelm them by attacking everywhere so they can defend. They're unable to defend everywhere at once, and was willing to at least temporarily abandon that mindset and go with a narrow front solution proposed by Monty to break through at a specific point in the German line, reinforce that success, and drive a dagger into the heart of Germany. What we haven't talked about to this point is the German army at the dawn of Market Garden. And no, I don't mean the two panzer divisions which were reforming in the Arnhem area, which played a pivotal role in deciding the conflict itself. I mean, how did the German army get from manning the Atlantic Wall to pinning the Allies up in the Normandy region, to essentially becoming a shattered force with no hope for victory in the Western Theater, and end up in the sorry shape that they were in Market Garden. Because rest assured, the German army was on the verge of coming to pieces during Operation Market Garden. The German army was fighting with a horribly insufficient logistical backing behind it. Its units were at incredibly depleted strength. The armored units, in some cases, had very minimal amounts of armor. And the Allies were launching this attack, perhaps to some extent, out of hubris, this belief that Germany was beaten and one final strong, firm kick would knock the Germans down and win the war for good. And that wasn't the case in the German army in the West just a couple of months earlier. What happened to the German military that it became so unable to contain and resist the Allies that it got into this shape? And, in one word, one really simple and overly sort of dismissive word, that word is Overlord, Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of France. Obviously, the German military in France is going to be in much better shape if there's no Allies there to worry about. But how did it get from a force of more than 50 divisions, granted depleted divisions, but strong divisions, occupying France, occupying Paris, and Holland and Belgium and whatnot, and how did it end up where it did? Well, obviously the answer starts at June 6, 1944, with the Allied invasion of France and in the Normandy region. The German military at the time of the Allied invasion was really broken into three high-level groups. You had General von Rundstedt, who was really in command of all of the Western theater forces. For simplicity's sake, obviously Hitler was above him and micromanaged frequently. But General von Rundstedt, sort of the old German general who was very successful throughout his career, one of the stalwarts of Nazi Germany's military, was in overall command, sort of. You then had General Erwin Rommel of the Desert Fox of the North African campaign fame, who was in command of the coastal forces, the defense of the fortifications ranging as far west as Brittany and as far east as Holland, so really the central part of the Atlantic Wall. The Atlantic Wall technically ran all the way through Norway. That was not General Rommel's sort of purview. His purview was Holland to Brittany. And then you had a third figure who really doesn't get talked about as much, and that was General Georg von Schwaffenberg, commander of German Panzer Group West, which in theory was kind of a planning and training and organization of armor, but in essence was the armored reserve of the German forces in France. So you have these three different personalities, all with very different views of how best to defend against France, and that's really where Germany begins to suffer and break down initially in its ability to defend against the Allies. For simplicity's sake, the Allies land in Normandy, the Germans defend the beaches, they contain the invasion, but they're unable to throw the Allies back into the sea. General Rommel, commander of the beach forces, believed that the Germans should deploy their panzer forces, their armored formations, near to the beach so that they would be able to immediately counterattack Allied forces as soon as they land and throw them directly back into the sea. General Rundstedt and General Schwaffenberg both had a different view of things. They believed in holding their armored forces back in toward the interior of France, allow the Allies to get ashore, allow them to penetrate in toward the sort of interior of France, or at least get ashore, and then mass a substantial armored column against them and counterattack them and defeat them. And while this sort of mindset is often derided by many sort of casual historians of saying, well, the Allies have such a numerical superiority, your only hope is to hit them when there's a limited number of troops ashore. Obviously, counterattacking immediately would be the sound tactic to follow. It wasn't totally without merit. I'm currently reading Con Anvil of Victory, which is sort of this classical work on the Normandy campaign from, I believe it was written back in the 60s, but it still holds up relatively well. And one of the things that it references when it talks about this German mentality is there in fact was a history of this kind of success on the Russian front. The Germans would mass armored columns, they would maneuver by night to avoid the masses of air force or artillery, and then they would launch massive sweeping attacks to cut the Allies off from their bases, destroy their forces in pockets, and the Allied invasion would break down from there. The problem was, in Western Europe, that the Allied air power was so much greater, and the Allied air superiority was so much greater, for the most part, than what the Russians had over the Germans, that maneuvering large armored formations would be very difficult without suffering substantial losses, and Rommel saw this. The logic that the Germans had was that, hey, listen, if we counterattack at the beaches, we're going to be in range of Allied heavy gunfire, which is going to absolutely devastate our forces and prevent us from being able to attack strongly. And there's validity to that as well. The lesson of Anzio is that, you know, the Germans came very close in the Anzio beach in Italy, where the Allies landed. Forces failed to move off the beaches quickly, and so they're really still stuck in this narrow corridor, this narrow salient, and the Germans start launching these massive counterattacks with armored units, with heavy units, into the teeth of Allied artillery, Allied naval gunfire, Allied air support, in a situation where the Allies don't have as much air cover as they do in Normandy. They don't have total air superiority in the way that they do in Normandy. They don't have the sheer amount of naval gunfire as they will at Normandy. And the German attack breaks down, and there are good incidences of Allied heavy cruisers and I don't know if they're really battleships, but certainly heavy cruisers pounding these German columns into submission. There's actually a probably Hollywoodified version of this, but if you've ever seen the old movie Big Red One, The Big Red One, which came out in the 80s, I believe it was, actually has Mark Hamill in it as a grizzled Army veteran in the 1st Infantry Division. Interesting enough, Luke Skywalker is in The Big Red One. And it has a scene of this where the infantry divisions are being counterattacked by German armor. They flee into a cave, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, all this heavy shell fire comes down and destroys these German forces, which were about to kill them. And this was represented as as naval gunfire coming to the rescue of the infantrymen, and it really did happen in Anzio, and that naval gunfire and air support in conjunction were really able to allow the Allies to hold on to an otherwise situation that would otherwise have been not tenuous. And so this debate around, you know, well, how could you even think of allowing them to build up? You know, often the Normandy campaign becomes known as the Battle of the Build-Up, and Germans would complain that the Normandy campaign was really a campaign of material versus man. The German men against the insurmountable manpower and resources of the Allied armies. And there's some truth to this, but again, remember, counterattacking thousands of ships with heavy guns and numerous battleships and cruisers that could pound your armored forces into dust isn't exactly appetizing. What do you do if you drive them off the beaches and into the sea, and now you're just sitting there exposed in open terrain near the beaches? The other piece is, what do you do during the preparatory bombardments? You know, one of the criticisms of the Normandy bombardments is that the bombing campaigns and the naval gunfire all landed well inshore. Well, if the armored forces are just barely offshore, you can rest assured that the Allies would have launched massive raids and artillery strikes against these forces if they were close into the Normandy coast. You can be assured that these would have been priority targets that would have been hammered mercilessly. And so, you know, this idea that simply holding these tanks and forces closer to the beaches would have necessarily resulted in grave problems for the Allies. If anything, it may have resulted in German armored forces that were weaker than they historically were and would have been unable to contain the Allies. It's hard to know for sure, but it certainly is possible. The Germans did have some initial counterattacks in and around the Caen area, with German armored units fighting very heavily against British and Canadian forces there and doing grave damage. But again, it's one thing when there's one division in the area. It's another thing if there had been, you know, the 6 or 7 or 8. I think the Germans had around 10 panzer divisions in Western Europe at the time. So if the Germans were able to bring in rapidly 4 or 5 localized into Normandy and launch immediate counterattacks, it's hard to say why they wouldn't have been just absolutely devastated by Allied error. The other piece is that the Germans simply didn't recognize the invasion was going to occur in Normandy. And before I get into this real quick, obviously we won the Battle of Schindel Road. We're moving on to the Vgo Bridge, which is one of the bridges that the Germans can blow, so we have to move forward and destroy this German force. I believe we have about 6 minutes to do so. Again, American airborne troops were further in the south. I believe this is still in the Eindhoven section, so the 101st Airborne section. We won the last battle without too much in the way of casualties, and we're going to try and press on and take the Vgo Bridge here in this particular fight that you're about to see unfold in front of you. But one of the other things is the Germans didn't necessarily know where the Allies were going to invade. The Atlantic Wall was this massive, thousands of mile-long fortifications all along the English Channel coast and also up into Normandy, or up into Norway, against an Allied invasion of Europe. And while Norway realistically was an unlikely thing for anything except commandos, the Germans really sort of were thinking that the Allies would come ashore at Pas-de-Calais, which was the logical place for any sort of amphibious landing to occur because it was the shortest distance between the British Islands and the French mainland. It was where the Germans originally planned to launch their invasion from during planning for Operation Sea Lion in 1940, and so the German planning of the invasion of England sort of shaded their own views on how the invasion of France would take place. And this actually hurt them too, because the Germans had two armies in the regions that we're really concerned about guarding the coastline. They had the 7th Army, which was guarding Brittany and Normandy, and then they had the 15th Army, which was guarding Pas-de-Calais. The 15th Army, because the Germans assumed that the Allies would be coming ashore at Pas-de-Calais, not only were the shore fortifications stronger there, but the army was stronger as well. It had about 19 divisions, had about 90,000 men. I believe the 7th Army had only around 70,000. So it had about 90,000 men, 19 divisions, and it was guarding this region of France. The problem for the Germans was, and then they had, they also had the 5th Panzer Group Army, or the 5th Panzer Army, or whatever that's classified under Schwevenberg, as I've already mentioned before, which is sort of these panzer divisions that were held back from the main coastline area. But the German problem was that they were still thinking about the invasion of Normandy in the lens of how they envisioned the invasion of Britain going. And what I mean by that is they totally underestimated the necessary shipping that would need to be leveraged in order to land a large force and maintain it across the coast. They just completely missed the boat on how many thousands of ships would be necessary and what the massive challenge of such an operation would be. And this was relevant because when the Allies come ashore on June 6, 1944, the Germans are not totally convinced that this is actually the main Allied effort. The initial thought is maybe this is a commando raid, something like Dieppe, which had occurred in, was it 1942, I believe it was, the raid on Dieppe? Yes, it was 1942, August of 1942. The Allies landed over 6,000 soldiers on the shores of Dieppe, which was a French port town in the Normandy region, and the Germans successfully repulsed with massive casualties this raid, which had sort of various mission goals in mind and kind of failed in all of them. And the Germans were thinking similarly along those lines when it came to the Normandy invasion, that maybe this was just a raid, a bigger Dieppe, essentially. And maybe the Allies were using this as a diversion so that their main force could come ashore in the Pas-de-Calais region. General Patton was given this sort of fictitious army, a whole bunch of fake displays and press and all these other things were going around, painting Patton as the commander of the eventual invasion, rather than General Bernard Montgomery, who would actually command the Allied forces during the invasion. Obviously, General Eisenhower, the supreme commander of all Allied forces, was in overall charge, but commanding the actual battlefield operations was General Bernard Montgomery. The British and Canadians had 3 beaches, the Americans had 2. They had more, the British and Canadians had more forces going ashore in the first day's operations, and so a British commander was in charge. But all of this press and misdirection or whatnot fooled the Germans into thinking the Allies were going to come ashore at Dieppe. And the Germans' own experience in planning for Operation Sea Lion and their complete misunderstanding of the massive logistical hurdles made them believe that even when the Allies clearly had tens of thousands of soldiers ashore in Normandy, the Germans still thought it would be possible for the Allies to land troops in Pas-de-Calais. And this belief, this fear that Normandy was nothing but a diversion, would lead to Germany, one of Germany's big mistakes in the campaign. Honestly, I think it can be debated whether leaving the tanks inshore or leaving them inland were the better route. I think often you hear that leaving them toward the beaches would have been the better route, but who knows? If the Germans have this massive concentration of tanks in close to the beaches, it certainly presents an appealing target that would have been struck by Allied attacks. With that being said, one thing that I think cannot be debated is the German failure to react to Normandy adequately. The 7th Army in the Normandy and Brittany region does react. It does manage to pin the Allies in close to the beaches, just a couple of miles off the beaches. The Allies make it about 6 miles off the beach on the first day. They fail to take the town of Caen and will fail to take it for another 6 weeks after the invasion. But the Allies sort of create this sort of small beachhead. They start reinforcing. They start bringing hundreds of thousands of soldiers ashore, but they're stuck in this Bockish country, this area of strong hedgerows and fields and very good defensive terrain that the 7th Army is able to wedge them in. The Germans, under increasing pressure, begin losing massive numbers of casualties, and it becomes very apparent very quickly that while the Germans are doing an effective job of resisting the Allies, in fact, I believe something like 1 in 10 Allied soldiers becomes a casualty in this early phase of the operation, which is an incredibly high figure, nearly even casualties with the Germans, actually. The Allies are comforted by the fact that they're only dealing with one German army. The German 15th Army in the Pas-de-Calais region just sits there and doesn't move. And in some ways, this is sort of the impetus for Market Garden, and this is going to shape the Allied response to their breakout. And what I mean by that is, if the 15th Army had moved right away, 90,000 men, there's no doubt that they would have been subject to massive aerial bombardment from the skies, that air power would have been unleashed, but there's also no doubt that 19 divisions would not have been destroyed by the air alone. In fact, the Germans were well accustomed to moving at night and likely could have moved a large number of their forces at night. Or maybe they would have just moved some of their forces, kept other forces there. But the Germans' failure to understand that this was the main effort, and their failure to understand that it simply was not possible for the Allies to launch another landing somewhere else without first evacuating Normandy, was a key moment. If the Germans had brought 90,000 additional troops to Normandy, it's very likely they could have bottled the Allied forces in Normandy up for an even longer period of time. The attacks in and around the strategic town on the right, well, I guess Allied left flank, German right flank of Normandy at the Battle of Caen would fix the vast majority of the German panzer divisions in place, so that after numerous attacks and failures, eventually taking the town, driving just a little bit south of the town, the Germans had something like 6 or so of their panzer divisions facing the British, only about 2 facing the Americans, and eventually Operation Cobra would see the Americans break out on the German left flank, race into Brittany, race around the German flank, and begin to encircle the 7th Army. This is where we really see the relevancy to Operation Market Garden come from. Because as the Germans are, or as the Allies are breaking out, the Germans have these orders to hold in place. They continue holding their lines at Caen, and eventually the German troops begin encircled by the Allies. The Germans launch an ill-fated counterattack against the Allied flank. The thought was some 300 or so panzers, despite protests from his generals. Hitler orders an armored thrust to try and cut off the Allied breakout, and this goes terribly wrong. It is known as Operation Lüttich, also known as the Battle of Mortain, in which 3 German panzer divisions, 2 infantry divisions launch a counterattack against the Allied breakout under the American General Omar Bradley. The Americans have about 5 infantry and 3 armored divisions engaged. The Americans do lose a substantial number of casualties, but the Germans lose over 120 tanks. They lose more than half of their armored spearhead is destroyed in this counterattack near Mortain, and this begins the this sort of completes the downfall of the German panzer forces in and around the Normandy region. The actual result is that the Germans are sort of forced by Hitler to stay in their positions, and the Allies, as they drive south and east, begin to encircle the 7th Army, and the 7th Army kind of gets stuck in its position and is pocketed in and around an area of France called Filiz. the town of Filiz, which becomes known as the Filiz Pocket, in which the 7th Army is surrounded and a large amount of it is destroyed. Now, a big piece of its destruction is actually in air power. The Allies bombard this pocket to no end. Allied tactical bombers and air units come in and strafe and destroy vast quantities of German equipment. Some 50,000 German soldiers are captured. Some 500 tanks or assault guns are destroyed. The Germans do actually have a sizable amount of men escape as well. I think around 50,000 soldiers escape also. So there's always sort of this aftermath, this thought that, hey, if only we had been more effective in our surrounding of the Germans, we would have had better results later on. We would have maybe gotten into Germany sooner. The Germans have a lot of soldiers that do get away, but they get away without equipment. In many ways, it's kind of like a Dunkirk in that there are tens of thousands of German soldiers who do escape from the Falaise Pocket, but they're all left without equipment. And only then, only when this force is being destroyed, when the 7th Army, or what's left of it, is being destroyed at Falaise, after the breakout of Normandy, after the failure at Mortain, after the pocketing at Falaise and its attempt to escape, only then, when the 5th German Panzer Army and the 7th German Army are essentially mauled beyond any recognition, only then does the 15th Army begin to move and try and stem the Allied advance. And by now, instead of 3 German armies, 1 panzer, 2 infantry, instead of 3 German armies, one of them being the strongest, coming in and reinforcing and helping bottle the Allies into Normandy, this army is thrown into the Battle of the Breakout. And by then, Allied air power is devastating. German forces are on the retreat. A lone German army against over 800,000 and shortly over 1 million men is going to have no chance at stopping the Allied breakout. The Allies swing south, they liberate Paris in August, and they drive east on Holland and Belgium. And these German troops get thrown into it. In an attempt to stem the advance, they really do very little of anything except lose massive casualties in the 15th Army. They get driven back into Holland, and while there's still a very functional force, there's still tens of thousands of these soldiers, this force is badly depleted for constant fighting, and 2 panzer divisions are withdrawn from the front in order to begin reforming in and around Arnhem in September of 1944. I had sort of skipped German High Command's own sort of disorienting and confusing and disheveled setup where they were seeing von Rundstedt replaced, and then von Klug is assigned and replaced, and just overall German High Command was in a cataclysmic place. Confusion. General Rommel is wounded and pulled from the front. At the same time as sort of the breakout is occurring, there's the German officer conspiracy against Hitler and the failed attempt to assassinate Hitler. There's just a lot of confusion at the German High Command that's going on. But long story short, the Germans are thrashed in Normandy. They fail to commit a concentration of force substantial enough to pin the Allies in and around Normandy longer. The German 7th Army is, for all intents and purposes, as far as we can discuss here, is largely destroyed. The German 5th Panzer Army is largely destroyed. The German 15th Army is thrown into a hopeless situation without supports and is badly mauled. The Allies break out and drive through France, liberate Paris, drive through Belgium, and are at the doorstep to Holland. The Germans do have tens of thousands of soldiers, part of the 15th Army, in and around the Scheldt estuary, which is blocking access to the port of Antwerp, which has just been retaken by the Allies. So they've retaken this massive port, this port equal of New York in terms of its ability to handle cargo, but it is completely unable to be used because the port does not have a waterway access, because the Germans blocked the access via the Scheldt estuary. And what's left of the 15th Army is doing that, as well as reforming in and around the Holland region under General von Rundstedt, who has retaken command of the Western Theater forces and begins to bring order from the chaos. And that is the situation on the verge of Operation Market Garden. 2 German armies nearly destroyed, 1 German army mauled, the Allies triumphant, but their supply problems coming to bite them in the ass. And that's the sort of situation of how these 3 German armies were ravaged, how the Allies were able to break out, and how the Germans were kind of committing their forces piecemeal. right? The 7th Army, then bring up the 5th Panzer Army to support it, leave the 15th out of the fight until it's too late, and then deploy them and have them get really shattered as well. And that's where we're at. So that kind of leaves us on the edge of the Operation Market Garden. That's where we got to here in episode 3. In terms of the battle that's taking place on the screen in front of you, we took the Vgo Bridge, and we are now in the Arnhem suburbs with our troops trying to race along the riverway to get to the Arnhem Road Bridge in the town itself. This was a historical event which occurred, which a battalion or so of British soldiers were able to sneak past German soldiers and make it to the rail bridge. We're in the process of trying to reduce the German troops to our front so that we may advance on Arnhem town itself. You can see here, actually, the forces that we have at our disposal are the exact forces that we fought the Arnhem Rail Bridge battle, so you have carryover casualties in this game in close combat. Carryover casualties and limited reinforcements. Each day you get a limited amount of reinforcements to your troops, and kind of what you start with and what you spend. If you spend all those reinforcements, you can't get more between battles. So we spent all our reinforcements ahead of the Battle of the Rail Bridge. Those casualties were lost, and now we have what's left from that force to fight here in the suburb battle. Now the good news is, this I don't think is going to be a very substantial battle because we destroyed all the German forces in front of us in the last fight. I think the number of German troops because the Germans operate, I believe, under similar rules, I think there will just be a handful of soldiers here for us to face and mop up with. But I think we'll take care of that in our next video. This was sort of the German situation on the verge of Market Garden following the breakout, and we'll take a little bit deeper dive into more of the history in our next video next time around. But I hope you guys are enjoying this series. It's hard, this is probably going to be a once-a-week type deal where I look at close combat and I talk about the history just because of the research I've got to do. Again, I wasn't speaking at any in-depth level. These were all sort of superficial, high-level things, but when I don't script things out incredibly detailedly and I kind of just go off off what I know and sort of the way I organize things in my mind, I need to know more than what I'm just talking about. So with that being said, peeling back the curtain a little bit there, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Leave your thoughts below, and until next time, this is the Historical Gamer saying thank you for watching, and I'm out.